Hello and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast. Today my guest is Christina Granahan, who is an Enneagram-informed therapist and coach, as well as a social worker. So today we really break down the Enneagram. We talk about the 9 different types, the subtypes, how knowing the Enneagram can help with stress management, building deeper relationships, understanding ourselves more, and it shines the light on our shadow self, which is where we can have the most growth and development. In order to get the most benefit from this podcast, I would suggest going to the Enneagram Institute. Go there, take the test. It takes 40 minutes and it's about $20. And it will really shine light on this episode and this podcast. But also, I have to say, it was one of the hardest self-evaluation tools that I've ever taken. It really makes you look at your shadow self, and that can be a bit challenging. So I would encourage you to be super, super honest with yourself, and you're going to have so many takeaways from this podcast. So I really hope that you'll enjoy today's episode. And please, if you do, take a moment to give us a like, a share, and a subscribe. And I want to thank you so much for being here today. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast, a place to explore possibility through mindfulness, movement, and self-discovery. Our intention is to deliver insight and inspiration while fostering conversations that are genuine, unfiltered, and deeply human. We hope you will enjoy today's episode. Hi, Christina. Good morning, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nikki. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad that we're talking about the Enneagram because I've been really curious about it for many, many years. And so it's my understanding that there are 9 different types within the Enneagram. So I'm curious about when those types develop. Do we develop those types when we're young in our formative years, and then by the time we're in a teen years that type is set, or are we born into a type?
It's a great question. We're born with a type. And so separate from the Enneagram, Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist, many people know him, specializes in child development. Like the way he describes this is like for 9 months, every need we have is taken care of. And he says from the moment we're born to the moment we die, we have to fight for everything we have. And what he really means by that is, so we're born and we have to do certain things to belong, right? Like we have to look at how we are going to belong in our families. We have to adapt and adjust. We cry to get food, all that kind of stuff. We are also born with a sensitivity in our personality. That's sort of how psychology has typically described this, is a temperament or a sensitivity. And what the Enneagram has done is sort of taken that sensitivity, that becomes our type. And it's the place where I would argue our greatest liabilities and our greatest gifts lie. It's sort of the things that are going to trip us up in our life come from that type, and the things that are going to really help us to grow into this like real gift that we have, you know. But the other piece about this is that we have all 9 types within us. I also describe this as the 9 parts of our personality that you have various access to at any other time. So we're born with it, but then we're born into a family with other personalities. And so that is going to influence sort of how the type gets expressed, or how our type is confirmed, you know, within a family. And so there is definitely influence of nurture there.
So when we're born, and as we grow older too, we have aspects of all 9 types, but there's one type that we have a predisposition to when we're born, and then how our family treats us and how we evolve in the world kind of develops that type further. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Like if unchecked, this type is the thing that's going to get you into trouble. It's going to be the thing that you likely overdo while you're trying to get these needs that Dan Siegel talks about met.
And so what I'm hearing too is that from the Enneagram, we can learn our greatest assets and our biggest shadows.
100%. Yeah.
And I think our shadow is where we learn the most. If we can dive into our shadow and look at that, that's where the most personal growth can come from, is how to navigate the shadow.
I would agree. I mean, I think shadow work is absolutely deep psychological work, and the Enneagram can point you to like help you sort of to see it.
Yeah.
But the Enneagram also has uses in places like a work setting, or like there's other places where it doesn't have to be deep psychological or spiritual work. It's really looking at blind spots. There's other language that we use around it. Yeah.
And so before you and I talked, and in between that time and now, I went online and took the test to find out my type. So I would love for you to share with people, because it was $20 and I got a pretty comprehensive report. So if you could share with people how they could take that test, and maybe this podcast would serve them better if they were to spend the $20, take the test, and then kind of follow along as we chat.
Yeah. Yeah. And I certainly don't know every Enneagram assessment out there. And I think there's more and more being developed. But the one that I suggest that people use is from the Enneagram Institute. And it's enneagraminstitute.com. And you can just go to testing center at the top. So you take that test or an assessment. It takes about half an hour, maybe. Don't overthink it. Just answer the questions. And then it will give you, it'll send you a packet of information of your top 3, usually types. If there's a tie, sometimes it'll go to 4 types or 5 types. And I suggest people go through it with 3 different color highlighters. One to just highlight everything that you're like, yeah, that's me. One that you're sort of like, that's definitely not me. And one that's kind of like, eh. And then you sort of start to find your type. I will say, as you and I have talked about, I really do believe that no Enneagram assessment, nothing online is going to be able to really tell you your type. It will point you towards a place to look, but your core motivation is really what we're looking at. It's not about what you do. It's not about your behavior, although that impacts it. It is, it's really about what drives you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to admit, taking the test made me extremely uncomfortable. It definitely made
Everybody
me
says that.
look at my shadow. And then I'm trying to be honest and really looking at some of the things that aren't so pretty about my personality and how I think and how I navigate the world, and wanting to be honest in the test. And it was intense taking it. I was surprised at how hard it was. I think it was one of the hardest assessments I've taken, and I've taken a lot of different assessments and
My guess
used
is
a bunch of tools.
Yeah, my guess is, Nikki, that's because you strike me as someone who's done some inner work. Like you've done some work on yourself, so you are aware.
Yeah.
And but if we're just kind of like never sort of done any inner work, not really paid much attention, it is. The truth is, a lot of people complete that based on who they want to be and not who they actually are.
Yeah.
But that's where a lot of the work comes. Like I just thought I was self-actualized. I continue to discover so much about myself that were complete blind spots.
Yeah. And I think the report is really interesting because it does talk about your attributes and your fine points and all the things that are great about you. And as much detail as it gives you that, it gives you the shadow piece. And so it is a really great test, but I would say it's not easy to look through. I think it's important, but I don't think it's easy.
Yeah, I appreciate that distinction. I don't think anyone's ever sort of said it that way before, but I think if you want to do the work, it is important and it's not easy. And most teachers would say, some say, if you don't feel shame when you're reading your type, you might have the wrong type. I say, if you don't feel a little zing, if there's not like a little, you probably haven't landed on your type,
And you and I talked about this. I know we are going to jump into the 9 types, but when I took the test, my top scores were 21, 21, and 20. There was a tie between my 2 highest and then my second highest. And the 2 highest were off just a point, which in the realm of all those questions that were answered, I don't think that that's significant. But the top 2, I read them and there are aspects that fit, but then definitely aspects that didn't fit where I was shaking my head. And then when I got to the third one, my third highest score, that was where everything resonated and it was all true. And you had said that it might not be your highest score, that you might need to look at all of them and then discern which one is most fitting.
Yeah. And the truth is, I'm working with someone right now and he believes his type is not even in those top 3. Typically they are. And I think it's okay and actually pretty common that people will mistype themselves. So my husband, for example, thought he was a 5, maybe for a year. and then did some work in type 5 and sort of cleared away some stuff. And he's like, actually, I'm a 9. I'm definitely a 9. That happens a fair amount. And it's not wasted time because you're working on one aspect. You sort of clear the garbage there. And then you start to see, oh no, this is the thing that really gets me stuck. And you get your right type. And that's okay, you know?
Yeah. So let's go through the 9 types, because I was listening to a podcast earlier this morning in preparation for this podcast. And the guy was saying, really just listen to the descriptions of all the different ones and not necessarily even taking the test, but listen to the descriptions and then figure out which one resonates for you the most. And so I think that somebody can get benefit from this podcast by listening to what we have to say about the 9 types and then going online and exploring more deeply about what those types are specifically.
Yeah. There's a lot of Enneagram teachers who don't use any online assessment, and that's a really valid way to do it. I just think it makes it a little faster. But yes, absolutely. Like the old way was to read the types and then you choose it.
But I have to say, going through the testing process was therapeutic in itself, because it did make me look at some things where I thought, oh no, like that is definitely an attribute of mine that I need to work on. Yeah, I think it is important to go through the test.
You know, Nikki, you're actually pointing to something that I think isn't talked about enough, which is the only way to do this work is if you're willing to be honest with yourself. You know, we are really crafty humans, and we can sort of say, oh no, or justify our behavior or whatever. But you really have to take an honest look at what's actually showing up.
Yeah. And I do, like, my saying for 2024 has been, the way to grow is to move through discomfort. And so if something's making you feel uncomfortable, that's amazing, because that discomfort is telling you something, and that's a growth point. And so it's about moving through those spaces of discomfort instead of running away from them. As we get older, we tend to avoid things that make us uncomfortable, even activities or parties or people or conversations. We just tend to run and avoid. And that's not the way that we're going to grow and evolve and move towards light.
I would 100% agree. Yeah. It's really cool.
All right. So let's dive into the different types.
Okay. So I want to say that people can get information about the types in a lot of different places. All of the types are going to look similar no matter who you're learning from. All types have something in common with other types. The Enneagram is really about triads. So there's lots of different triads that we look at. So there's all this intersection that make it seemingly complex, but that's where the real learning comes, I think. And so feel free to ask me anything about that stuff too. But
what are the 3 main types?
So we receive information in our gut. Our instincts live in our gut. Our sense of boundaries. So, like, you know, you could have your eyes shut and know when someone's standing too close to you. That's body intelligence. Things like, am I tired? Am I hungry? Like those that lives in the body. And the 3 types that come from the body center that tend to sort of live into the world or step into the world or receive information that way are the 8, 9, and 1. And the thing about the 8, 9, and the 1, what they're really going for is autonomy and respect. And then they tend to have issues with anger. And then we shift into the heart center, and the heart intelligence is that part of us that knows what we want, what matters to us. It's where our identity, our sense of like who we are lives, our sense of connection to other people. And the heart types tend to be concerned with image. They're really concerned with how are they seen. And so that's the 2, 3, and 4. And they tend to have issues with shame. Shame tends to be the dominant sort of affect for them. And then moving into the head center, the head intelligence is like when we're clear in the head, when we're acting from our higher head center, we know what to do. We know who we trust. We know sort of like who's on our side. There's like this sense of just clarity and head intelligence, which is what those 3 types, 5, 6, and 7 are really after: stability, safety, security. And they tend to have issues with fear. And if you think about this, I think about this from a little child's perspective. So every kid wants autonomy. They want to be sort of like independent and contributing. Like there's something about that. And every kid wants to be seen, right? They want to be seen by their parents. And every kid wants to feel safe and secure. They want to know someone's watching the ship. And so these are just these basic human needs that live in our nervous system, but different types lean into them differently. So that happens to be one triad. The way your type actually develops is without consciousness or awareness, we're leaning into two of those things and neglecting another. It's there, but we sort of forget about it. Each of the types tends to forget about one of those centers. So I'll just use myself as an example. I'm a 7. I'm thinking and doing without consciousness, thinking and doing, thinking and doing, thinking and doing. I get overcommitted. I'm just doing the next shiny thing. I want to be excited all the time. So I'm not very niched in my thinking or focus.
Yeah.
I forget to check in with my heart. Like what actually matters to me? Like what is actually important to me? That's been a huge game changer for me. So each of the types, I could do that for each of the types. Like what's their forgotten center?
Each specific type has one forgotten center. Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So do you want me to go through the 9 types?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's do that.
Okay. I'm going to say one thing before I go through them, which is the way our identity develops is this sensitivity that we have. So I'll start with 8. So 8 is born sort of understanding that we all have a strength and a power that is just innate. We all have this ability to lead, to direct, to just be in the world like in a strong, independent, confident way. And what happens is there's like an existential crisis that happens. It really could just be your caretaker says, no, you can't do that. And the 8 interprets that as, oh my God, there's no strength in the world. There's nothing independent. Like I can't be independent. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to like, there's no strength or power for me. And so the little child 8 says, I better become that thing that I think doesn't exist. So the identity develops around strength. So the 8 says, I'm the strong one. So that becomes their identity. I won't do that for every type, but when I talk about the thing that describes the type, that's what's sort of happening is they forget about some of those other 8 types and they say, oh, I'm the strong one. So that's where the shadow comes. So if I'm strong, I therefore maybe am not vulnerable. So we're going to disown that part of myself. So they're striving. They're sort of attached to being strong, being independent, being confident. They're real action oriented. They're self-starters. 8s at the high level, when 8s are healthy, they're amazing leaders and they want to teach everyone else how to be a leader too. What they want for themselves, they want for everyone else. And at the high side, they can actually access their heart. They sort of know what they want and they have compassion for others and they lead from that place. But as they become sort of in the more average level of functioning, which is most of us, they forget about their heart. And so there's just, there can be a sort of a bullyish aspect or a controlling aspect that strength just gets distorted and becomes controlling.
And it seems like they always look at life through power dynamics.
Yeah, they would argue that they are the most power, like they're going to be the power in the room, you know, but there's always going to be a power dynamic. What I will say about 8s is that they do kind of want you to meet them in that place. Like they don't really want you to be weak in front of them, right? Because another way of describing Enneagram types is the bias that we have about how people should be. And so an 8 believes that we should be strong, you know?
So meet me in my strength, but you're not stronger than me.
Exactly. Yeah. It is where it is like on overdrive. It's going to be bullying, right? It's going to be like, oh no, you have a place. But at a healthy level, it's like, oh yeah, we're both here together. We can meet each other in that. Yeah, exactly.
We're both strong. We can hold power together.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're starting in the body centers. That's why I started at 8 and that's why I didn't start at 1. So, and then we move on to 9. 9 is, what they generally tend to be like, they're the peaceful ones. That's what they're going for. There's this very calm, pleasant way. Nines are mediators. Like they walk into a room and everyone just sort of is like, oh, like it just feels good.
Mm-hmm.
And they bring this like sort of level-headedness to a group. They're excellent listeners. They're really laid back. They don't need to exert themselves or put themselves into like an 8 into a control to be in control. But there's just this way in which they are. They really represent presence itself. However, like when that gets distorted, the 9 sort of says, I don't want to be impacted and I don't want to impact you. They don't really tell your opinion, whatever you want, that actually does the opposite of bring peace to people. People want 9s to engage. They want your opinion. 9s have forgotten that. They sort of, they pull themselves out. They're listening, but they're not going to engage unless asked.
Because they don't want to create conflict or turbulence. They just want to like have everything calm.
They mistake that for peace. Like they think that they're bringing peace. In fact, I have a client who in a group, she's a 9 and she said, I just leave the room when there's conflict. And someone else in the group said, that actually drives me nuts when my husband leaves the room in a conflict. And she was like, I thought I was being helpful. I thought I was minimizing conflict. And the other person in the group was like, you're actually creating conflict. It was she still talks about it a lot, like how that was a game changer for her in her relationships because she didn't realize it. Like she really was just going to keep the peace, but it wasn't keeping the peace.
I had the same conversation with my girlfriend. We went hiking last night and her husband, when he gets angry, he leaves the room and creates space. And then this creates this abandonment wound for her.
Yes.
And so he thought he wanted to keep the peace and not express anger, yet that was triggering for her.
Yeah. 9s are super uncomfortable with assertiveness or being in the spotlight because they see that as inserting themselves in something. But really what we do with 9s is help them to find that part of themselves that is outstanding and should be in the spotlight. It's not self-centered and selfish to sort of claim your space. And they have to learn that.
And that's a perfect example of shadow, right? Just learning that is taking that shadow out and then shining from it.
Yeah. The lines on the Enneagram really are indicative of where you're going to find your shadows. So for a 9, type 3 might be a shadow. And that's what I just described in the 3. Yeah. Okay. So type 1, the essence is about goodness and sacredness. 1s get that sort of imperfection is part of the bigger picture of perfection, that in order to get where we are today, people had to die. There was a huge explosion in the sky. And yet this is where we are. And this is where goodness is inherently here. They get that at this sort of healthy level. But as in the average place where we're just sort of not conscious and just doing our thing, they're really like working really hard to be right. There's a way in which they're super logical. There's rules. They're very concerned with rules and doing what the rules are. They often talk about appropriate behavior and who should and shouldn't be the way they are. And so they tend to be super critical at the average levels and judgmental. They actually just see themselves as upholding what's good and right in the world. Like it's not personal, right? It's like, no, don't you want to know what's wrong with you? Because I'm assuming you want to know because you want to be good, right? But that's not received well in the world.
Right.
So that's sometimes the work. They tend to be super, super competent people in the world.
They're super perfectionistic. So they want everything done a specific way. And then other people probably can't do it as well as them. And so they get critical.
100%. I actually, as a 7, I have a line to 1. I noticed that I am really a type 1 parent in many, many ways. And what I ended up doing is raising kids who thought there was something wrong with them. I thought I was teaching them how to be adults, but I didn't see that I was super critical. And so now I see it, So then moving into the heart center, type 2, type 2 is like they are born understanding that love exists. Love just exists in the world without us having to earn it, prove it. But 2s sort of develop this identity of like, what if there is no love in the world? I better be the love. And so they tend to be really concerned with connection with other people, relationships. They're super helpful. They're going to be really concerned about all the needs that are out there, but they really actually neglect their own needs. They don't see themselves as having needs. They're the relational people. Like in an office, they're the ones who bring in the cake for everyone's birthday. They're the ones who are going to make a phone call and not text oftentimes, or they sign up to volunteer. There's a lot of ways that this sort of gets manifested, but twos are really over-identified with their heart and how to sort of bring that out into the world. At the average levels, though, you can imagine it can feel like a boundary violation. It's sort of like, why don't you want me to get you tea right now? Don't you want tea? I'm going to get you tea. Like, I'll go make you something. It just gets exhausting sometimes to be around someone who is constantly offering you something and also won't accept. It doesn't feel like an equal relationship to the other people. And so, but it's at the high side, it's a beautiful, very loving, very generous. And that's how twos see themselves.
So they're so people pleasing and other focused that they forget to focus on themselves, and they might get lost in that process.
They forget to focus on themselves. But if you think about this as like your adrenals, like, I'm going to be helpful. 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 And their needs are still not being met. They're still not really being seen that way, because it actually sometimes isn't helpful. And then there's almost like a flipped behavior. And then they might get passive aggressive. They might get resentful that no one's helping them. They might, there's ways that's a little bit of the shadow, right? They don't see that part of themselves.
Yes.
Twos, really, that their generosity is there with some sort of intention way in the back of their minds that someday that will be returned.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have some too. I have some too.
Yeah.
That was one of the ones I scored high on, but I identify with that of giving a lot in relationships and then having some sort of expectation from others and sometimes being disappointed. And that makes sense.
Yeah. It's really like beautiful, but there is this way in which they want to be seen. They want to be admired for the generosity that they have. And it's beautiful. I find it exhausting.
And that was the Mother Teresa one.
Yeah. And it's, when I say that, what I really am saying is she embodies the energy of a two. We can't really say what she's motivated by, because there is no one behavior that applies to only one type, So as you said,
she would be the epitome of the highest form of that too.
Yeah, I would say. I will say 2 is sort of the archetype in our culture for mothers. 8 is sort of the archetype for fathers, or the protective figure. I don't mean to be gender specific, but the protective figure, and 2s are really the archetype for the nurturing figure.
That makes sense.
So type 3 sits right in the middle of the heart center. Type 3 is really wanting to be successful in whatever way that means. You could be it could be, if you're a monk, maybe you're the best meditator, or in a business setting, you're competing to sort of like be seen as successful. So they're really striving. There's this energy that goes into like being outstanding, and they are.
Yeah.
3s are efficient, effective, productive. Like when you want something done, you give it to a 3.
It's like the archetype of the first child.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I wonder if there's some correlation between the first child, where they're the overachievers typically, right? We're stereotyping, but the overachiever, they're great at sports, they're really sociable, they're friendly, they have lots of in their social network.
Yeah, they are, and they're assertive. They're going for what they want. That's right. They're just responsive. They show up with what's needed. At the average levels, though, it can feel a little competitive. They don't really want to be one of many. They want to be outstanding.
The one.
Mediocrity is not okay. Yeah. So then moving to 4, still the heart center. 4s are really looking like they're born sort of with this sense of like, we are deep and beautiful creatures uniquely, like we are all different. The types might think we're all the same. We're all come from one of many, like the 9, but the 4 is like, we are deep and beautiful creatures. And so there's this sort of endless seeking for the ways that as the 4 in me is like always wanting to find that depth and meaning in everything, right? There's a moodiness that sort of comes with it. It's beautiful, but like, can we really ever be that deep, right? Like that's sort of where, it needs to be balanced with something. So they tend to be super interesting, super expressive. The 4s are the ones who are like, I don't know, in high school, like color your hair pink. I mean, when I went to high school, that was unusual. So like, let's just go with that.
Yeah.
Generation, color your hair pink. And then they sort of find all the other people who colored their hair pink. And so then they become one of many again. But there's this way in which they really want to be understood, but they don't let you understand them because it's like, oh, no, you don't really get me, right? That's sort of how it can show up in the average levels. And so they tend to be connected to their suffering. Like, you really do not understand how hard that life is for me can sometimes be that energy. Yeah.
And I was seeing that was a lot of artists and a lot of creatives and people in that field.
Yeah. It's really beautiful, like sometimes the clothing is expressive and the language is expressive. The other thing I will say about 4s, they can be with anything. Like, they will take grief and can sit with someone who is grieving the loss of a child, and they will just be there with you. And it is actually amazing to watch. Like, nothing makes them uncomfortable in terms of like those sort of darker emotions. They're not avoidant of that. It's really quite lovely.
It makes me think of, to stereotype a little bit, but like an artsy kid in high school that is unique and different, and that's kind of a pride point for them, that unique and different, and yet also this mysterious, nobody will understand me aspect.
Yes. Yeah. I will say, since you brought it up, like, I do think young women often, and young men, I guess, like, often want to be seen and as an individual, and that's sort of the crux of the 4.
But I guess if you look at that person in high school, and then you look at that person in their 50s and 60s, where they are the artist and they are being expressive and they are honoring that piece that's different, and they're embracing that, and that's their uniqueness and that's their light. So it's kind of stepping into it more fully.
Yeah, we can all step into that. There is a little like stereotype in the Enneagram world that like 4s are the creatives. All types can be creative. It's really about, why are you creative? It's an identity with who I am. Like, and can anybody really know anybody? Right? Like, that's sort of the question of the 4. So, so then moving into the 5, 6, and 7 tend to be concerned with safety and security. So the 5's identity, they call it clarity and illumination. I almost think of it as light. There is light. Like, we can know things. There's a term, gnosis, which is, I know exactly what I need to know right now. And I know enough. And so the 5 at the high side just sort of knows things. And they're lighting this path for other people. But as the 5 sort of, gets more embedded or attached to their personality, they become sort of the know-it-all. My dad is a 5. And one thing we say about my dad is that if you ask him what time it is, he's going to teach you how to build a clock. I will say he knows more about everything than anyone I know. Like, he is really smart. And that's a form of anxiety, like he won't go to the doctor without really knowing everything. He wants to know if they're married. He wants to know where they were educated, where they grew up. He will do research on them before he'll go. That is a way in which his anxiety is playing out. But at the high side, they're really observant. They're really logical, very cerebral. They're a little detached. They sort of will leave the world to learn what they need to learn before coming back into it. Don't think of it as like this thinking thing. I think of it as a wanting to know and understand and share that knowledge with other people too. They're amazing teachers and scientists. In a business, they tend to want to be the back of the room, giving the information to the leader who will be the spokesperson. But they're doing all the research in the background. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And then going into 6, and I didn't say this before, but 3, 6, and 9, if you see that, they are all the centers of those centers. So the 9 is the center of the body center, the 3 is the center of the heart center, and the 6 is the center of the head center. So the other 2 types in those centers are versions of that. So the 6 is their inner guidance. That's what we say. Like, they're born knowing. We know the next step. we know what to do. We know the next right thing. And they lose touch with that. And they're really looking to be safe, secure, stable. So they tend to be super responsible. Like the 6 in me is part of me that's going to pay attention to a whole lot of things, make the right choice, do the right thing. They're really protective of the welfare, of the goodness of the bigger group. So they're looking out for things. What the 6 tends to do is ally with some group. So they outsource their inner guidance at the average level. So someone might call a friend and say, who should I vote for? Because they somehow feel connected to that friend. They're not going to go inside and say, what's important to me? What matters? Who am I going to vote for? They're going to find out who these other people are voting for and do that. So I have a fair number of nurses on my that I work with, and they're 6s. Lawyers, 6s, big advocates, for the underdog. They tend to be concerned also with sort of like what's the right thing to do in a similar way to the way the type 1 is. And at the average levels, the 6 thinks they have to pay attention to everything. But the higher levels, they know exactly what to pay attention to and exactly what to do. And so these nurses, I have this image of them being super responsive and awesome in a crisis, but in their homes, they tend to not be able to get out of their own way because they can't really find the thing they're supposed to be doing. That's where we do that work. But really, it's about safety and security and stability, right?
And I was reading something that resonated with me where I think we're hopeful, but we always have a plan B. Like if this were to go wrong, like I know if I go in a situation, I'm like, well, I'm going to do this if this happens, or this if this happens, or this if this happens.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes. So I didn't say this, but what I often say about 6s, they're amazing risk managers. Like we need the 6 to say, this could happen. Let's prepare for it.
I mean, it's funny because I created this bug out bag during COVID. We were having a lot of fires in Colorado, and there was just a lot of stuff happening. And I did all this research, and I created a bug out bag, and I gave one to my mom, and I put one in my husband's car, and I put one in my car. And my husband was thinking, why do you have all this anxiety around this? And I was like, oh, well, I created the bag and I'm done. Like that anxiety is gone. I've created it. If something were to happen, I just go grab the bag and I'm good to go. And I don't have that anxiety anymore. So he felt like I was doomsdaying and I was prepping for something and I had all this anxiety. And I was thinking, I'm just planning. So if something happens, I don't have to think. I just grab the bag and go, and I'm like done. And that seems like a typical 6.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Everything you're describing, like even, I mean, I didn't even use the word planning, but like if you're in a meeting with people and they're like, all right, so let's map out how we're going to do this. I mean, and before I learned the Enneagram, those people drove me crazy because I was like, can we just do it? Like, just do it. Let's just figure it out. We'll just do it as we go. Neither I drove 6s nuts and because we both need something different. But that risk management it's huge and it's important and having a plan, and so you actually said something that I think is really important about, the plan B. So we'll move into 7. 7s, they are sort of born knowing that, like 2s are born knowing that love is inherent, joy, freedom. It's here for us. It's just here. We don't have to create it. We don't have to look for it. We don't find it. It's here, inherent. And even in our dark moments, there is joy. My own experience of grief is actually that it comes with a little joy because it feels so true and real. And so the 6 part of me was a shadow. I absolutely didn't see it. But I used to say things like to my kids, we're going to have a really good vacation as long as our plane doesn't go down. Like it was like, so they heard our plane might go down and I heard we're going to have a great vacation. So they saw me as a worrier. Like they were like, you're typed wrong. You worry all the time. I was like, I don't worry. But then I started to listen. That honest paying attention that we talked about at the beginning of the call. And so, but 7s tend to bring like just this lightness and this joy to the situation. They are super good reframers. COVID hit, right? And with all due respect to all the loss in our world, I really did only see that it was me. I was like, my kids would never have had this chance to be together in the house. We're having like a
Mm-hmm.
frat party here, you know? And if we think about it as how I deal with anxiety, I couldn't let myself worry. It was too,
Mm-hmm.
I think, subconsciously terrifying. Everything's going to be fine, right? So we need our risk managers who's going to say,
Mm-hmm.
everything might be fine, but we better put this into place
Mm-hmm.
too. You know, that wouldn't have been me.
Well, so the confusing thing is 6 and 7 are my highest scores, almost equal. Yes, I didn't prep for this podcast. We had a pre-interview, we chatted, we connected, and there was no planning around it. So how do those two work together if
So the
they're
6
equal?
and the 7 are both, so like we said, both live in the head center, right? So they're going to be both thinking, planning, concerned
Yeah.
with what to do. I suspect that you identify with 6, so you're probably a 6 with a strong 7 wing. When we talk about the wings, the type is our core motivation, which I'll be honest with you, most people really get that. I would not have been able to tell you my core motivation when I started this work. I just didn't see it.
Mm-hmm.
But the wing is the number on either side of your type that describes sometimes your behavior. Like you described that thing about like you tend to be hopeful and positive, but you have a plan
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah, that is 6
describes,
and 7.
yeah, it's very similar to the way I describe it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we can't, until we're really doing a lot of work, we can't tell primary type. Like, am I a 6 wing 7 or am I a 7 wing 6? You know, there's so, if you think of the Enneagram almost like a color wheel, there's like an
Mm-hmm.
infinite number of possibilities. You could be a 6 that's really close to the 7 line, or a 7 that's really close to the 6 line. And those types are going to look super similar.
Mm-hmm.
But the core motivation will be a little bit different. Like your core motivation might be to be prepared and to be safe. My core motivation is to be free and have lots of options and choices.
Yeah. So okay, if a novice is using Enneagram, okay, would it be a better tool to use for self-reflection, or would it be a better tool to use to understand and be able to relate to others in a more meaningful way?
Well, I think the only way you can use it is for yourself, because our reactivity, like the things that activate us or trigger us, are going to be type related. The things that get us really fired up is our own work to do. So it is really about us. Having said that, I think there is huge value in sort of this more, I guess it's more of a meta thought of like, maybe that person isn't intentionally doing the thing that they're doing that's driving me crazy. I think this is a huge benefit in work settings where it gives us empathy. We may not know the types well enough, but to know that like what's going on for that person, but we might know that they're under stress, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
not who they are. So that
Yeah.
there's automatically a softening in that, you know, and we're just more present to what else is true. They're doing this thing that's driving me nuts, making me angry even, and it's not the entirety of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
If that
Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah.
So it's better as a self tool, and it's a good way to figure out where our best attributes lie, and then also our shadows, so that we can work on those shadow pieces. It seems like.
Yeah. We want to be able to see the whole truth of things. And our type, when we're stuck, only allows us to see through a particular colored lens. That becomes our identity. Yeah.
Well, and I like in the report how it talks about the different levels. And
Yeah.
so
Huge.
that shows us where our potential is when we
Yeah.
can meet that highest level of self. And then also when we go into the shadow, knowing that that's part of that type, but that there's always that potential in the higher realms.
Yeah. You know what, Nikki, I mean, as someone who like I'm a therapist, I have a social work background, and there was something about it that I was like, if I don't take care of myself, I am down with the diagnosis. Like those last
Yeah.
3 levels, 7, 8, and 9.
Yeah.
Those are usually therapeutic interventions that we need to get out of that. That's what happens when trauma happens, or when we don't respond, learn how to have more expansive responses to life events. And so that could be any of us, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I love
Yeah.
that. Well, I really appreciate you, and I appreciate this conversation. And I'm wondering if you could share how people can connect with you and what some of the offerings that you have are.
Sure. So I do help people type themselves. I have a singular one-off thing that people can meet with me to do that. I also work one-on-one with people, although I don't think I have any space available till probably January. What I really love to do is to hold groups and learn in groups, because you get to see, a 5 in real life. You get to see a 2 in real life, and we get to have a real conversation. My first group that I took, I felt like those are the relationships that I should have had with my siblings. Totally honest. We could talk about what we don't like about each other. It was really great. Anyway, so group work is what I love to do. And I will have a group opening in January for sure. And I also have a small community on Mighty Networks, which is like a Facebook group, but it's not on Facebook. So there's no algorithm, no tracking you. And that's free to join. I just pay for the membership, and because I just want to have a community of people talking about this. So the link to that is in the show notes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm on Instagram and I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll put all that in the notes. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, thank you, Christina. I appreciate our conversation and your time today. It was great.
Yeah. And if you want to reach out about your type stuff, you feel free. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you for listening to the Connected Community Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe. I can be found at www.nikkiyyoga.com, NICKYYYOGA.com. Until I see you again next week, I hope you have a beautiful day.